Okay, cool. So, I mean, I figured, like, I don't know, I think it's a really hard topic. It's probably the hardest one I've asked anyone to try and talk to me about on this podcast. So, sorry about that. But I'm sure you'll be able to say some interesting things about it. So, I guess I don't know where to start. I mean, here's a way of starting off. Some things about some ways of looking at logic. Well, the metaphysics of logic. It's such a weird, obscure area, and there's actually not that much written about it. Right? It's like your book is the only book that I found that like really explicitly is saying that we're about the metaphysics of logic. There's some other things out there, but there's very little. And a lot of the literature seems to be quite messy. It seems to be that there's loads of like really uber technical, really nerdy stuff that it's like the points are so difficult to get because you have to be like, you know, really into a specific, really formal theory to get anything out of it. And there's not, it seems to me there's some like gap in the market or something for a taxonomy or something, you know, the way that it's kind of commonplace to think about the different kind of metaphysical approaches to mathematical objects or what mathematics is about. You know, like Platonism, formalism, intuitionism, logicism. Everybody can sort of reel those off and say a quick explanation of what those mean. But I think it feels to me like there's less of an accepted categorization of that with logic. And I mean, so I guess maybe this is one way of starting the conversation. Do you think that there's a reason why people don't just have that simple way of looking at things, or do you think that's a helpful way of looking at things?
I think historically it's just been accepted, almost default position with logic, that it is a social construct, that it's in the mind, that it's laws of thought or language, or it's a human construct. That's been the default position. And so there hasn't been any of that inquiry where with maths, you've got some people think that it's in the mind and it's a human construct, and others are convinced that it's not, that it's outside of us and it's something independently real. So with logic, that hasn't been the case. So what I found interesting was to say, well, logic is a formal structure and it does relate a great deal to maths. Why have we got this? Why have we got this very different attitude toward logic? Why have we just accepted that we know what it is in the dichotomy that we have between the mind and the world? And that's been my interest forever. What's real? What's constructed? What's us? What's not us? And to me, logic is not us. It seems to me to be as compelling a case for logic not being a human construct as there is for maths. So that's why I kind of put the question to a bunch of people when I did the book. So that's where it started from.
Okay, great. And so the book is really interesting. It has, you know, I guess it's like 12 chapters or something, and so there's lots of different perspectives and lots of different types of related debates that are going on in that. So I think it's really interesting for anyone who's interested in this topic. It really feels to me like it's the only comprehensive place where you can sort of really dive into that.
Yeah, I felt really lucky to get those authors and to be able to read them myself and to have all those different points of view coming and looking at logic as a separate question, not just the philosophy of maths, but actually applying the same kind of thinking and the same kind of questioning, curiosity to the structures of logic. Having those great minds all writing on that was very exciting.
Yeah, it's great. And okay, so your position, I mean, so we're going to be thinking a bit about the paper that you have, which is entitled Logical Reason. I believe, is that the title?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. I'll link to it. So if anyone's curious what it says, they can read it for themselves. And so in that paper, your main task is to think about the relationship between logic on the one hand and reason on the other. So I think in a minute we might have to kind of pull those apart and explain why they're not just the same thing, kind of why they don't just mean the same thing, those two words. But then the claim is that they are in some way very closely related, like that one is a sort of canonical expression of the other, or one is just essentially the same thing as the other. And you're questioning that idea that maybe they're not the same thing. Reason and logic are just different things. And in the course of doing that, you defend briefly, I guess, you outline this idea of realism about logic. So realism about logic, does that mean something like Platonism does in the philosophy of mathematics? Is that how you're thinking about realism about logic?
Yeah, for me, it started off that way. I was very attracted to Platonism, and I did my thesis on a realistic philosophy of maths. But where I ended up was more of a contradiction, so more of a embracing of, if something's not us, but we can know about it, we can never really, we can't come up with a straightforward formula that expresses that relationship. So it's going to be something that sort of moves back and forth between something that's outside and independent and fundamentally inaccessible, and yet something that's accessible. And how to know when it probably just moves back and forth between that. It's both accessible and inaccessible, knowable and unknowable. But it's important to really tease apart what independence is in that sense, and that's where I really try to focus on what it does mean to know about something that is independent, and what that sort of boils down to. And I think it always involves an element of inaccessibility, but even saying it that way is not quite capturing what's going on. Yeah. But that's what I think is happening with logic. It's not straightforwardly just come out of our human socialization, our thinking, and our reason. The way we reason and the way we react to each other is a very different thing. If you're just looking at that, what's correct to do, what's correct to think in a certain situation isn't always going to be dictated by the laws of logic. So there might be a whole lot of different nuance and different things in play, like emotion and so forth, that logic can't dictate. All right, this is the right action, this is the reasonable, this is the rational. Those things, I think, pull apart from logic, because logic is a formal structure and it relates more to the way the world is. But I think it's also not so simple as to say it's abstracted from the way the world is. Same with maths. It's something more than that. It's something in itself, I think.
Yeah, right. So it's so hard to get a grip on the subject matter here. So there's something, on the one hand, it doesn't really seem like it's directly like involved with things, like in the same way that, I don't know, physics or something seems like it's abstract, it's an abstraction or something, but it's an abstraction about things bumping into each other or whatever, right? That's basically what it's about. And maybe logic in some senses is, I mean, it's hard for me to really get a clear idea really of I find it hard to picture the view that it's all in the mind, as well as I find it also hard to picture the view that it's somehow related to the way that the world is. I mean, so logical truths, like, I don't know, a principle like a law of non-contradiction or something, if you want to say that that is objectively true, and there's some aspect to that which is independent of just something about the way that our minds work, it's hard for me to know what it can mean that the world is such that the law of non-contradiction is true. Is it just a generalization about all the things that there are, that I don't know, that they have consistent properties or something? Is that what I mean, it's hard for me to know. Or were we just saying that there are these objects? There's this object, there's an abstract object, and it's called the law of non-contradiction, and it's real or something. I mean, like, is that how to think about it? Sorry if that question might not even make sense. I'm not even sure that.
No, it does, as much as it makes sense to ask the same thing about physical objects, though. I think it is a really, really curious question when you say what is objectively true or what is objectively real. And the easier word for me is independently real, because objectively, that's kind of a bit tangled with what we think. That's to my mind. So what is the way it is if there were no humans, what is the way it is, regardless of what we think.
Yeah.
And I think as much as we can get our heads around, all right, well, a rock is the way it is, and it wouldn't matter if we were existing or not. It has some sort of fundamental essence or being that's in and of itself. Now that seems like a straightforward thing, but if you actually really, really analyze that thought, sorry, I'm just going to have a drink of water. That is a really complex thought, and we don't know what that means. We really, it's the same. It's the same question in a way. So I don't think it's more problematic when you start to talk about laws and formal structures. And so, like a logical law, we don't have to say we know which ones are the ones that are probably the truest. So where you say the law of non-contradiction, there's lots of logical laws that are in competition with that one. So we don't know which is the truth. But to say that the structures that those laws describe are discoverable in the same way that physical reality is discoverable as something that we're actually approaching and exploring rather than creating is, I think, the best way to get a handle on it. Because it's not something we can touch or taste or see, doesn't make it more of a complex question, because if you put that question to physical reality, you'll find it gets just as confusing and just as complex.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And so I think there's probably some kind of weird, I don't know whether it's like a bias or something, but like the idea that, well, if there is like clumps of stuff bumping into each other, that's completely unproblematic, right? And we all know that there's some part of reality is like that. And then the question mark is just over, are there any other weird things out there? Yes or no? And that's what metaphysics is about. I think the way you're thinking about it, which I think is probably better, is that there's a question mark even over that sort of simplified stuff bumping into each other thing. And actually that's, no one's really believed that in physics for ages either, you know, with quantum stuff and strings. And so there's just this kind of like there's a big question mark over loads of things, and we have to kind of just plow on into the unknown and trying to figure out what's going on. And you can't just
be careful to always hold our, I suppose, our imagination and our construction and our approach, always hold that in check with the reminder that there's more. This is something that's discovery, and that's the important thing about realism. I think it's similar to the approach of a theoretical physicist, I suppose, where you do feel like this is something that is confounding, amazing, not necessarily ever going to be solved or visible, but it's not made up either.
Yeah, right. And that's, so what was there is also some kind of intractable element of our own cognition, it seems to me, that's in play when we're talking about, well, I mean, I think you're right to say that there's something like that going on when we're talking about something as obvious as a rock as well. Like, I mean, there's some like, I don't know, Kantian kind of, you know, idea about there being these conceptual schemes that are in play when we're trying to carve the world up into things that are rocks or rather than shoes or something. So like, you know, even just pulling those apart, there's going to be something mental or whatever that's involved in that. And I think in logic as well, there's going to be, there seems to be this kind of weird question mark over like, even if I feel like, I don't know, some non-contradiction, so just as some test thing to play with. So let's say we go, oh, okay, that's real, that's what it's like in the world or something. It always feels like that it's going to be difficult to know how much of that, I mean, am I in some sense pre-programmed to see only the, you know, or to only be able to understand the bits that are consistent? Is inconsistency just like a blind spot that I have? I mean, if there was an inconsistency, I don't know, whatever that even means, like in front of me, would I even be able to like recognize that or something? Like, so I feel like there's some kind of, it's difficult to know whether you've run up against the limits of your ability to understand something, or whether you've run up against an objective feature of the way that the world is. And with logic, it's very much in play. Like it's hard. And I suppose, but in your paper in that Metaphysics of Logic book, you're idea was that you kind of just like, there's an interplay between those two. You're kind of constantly moving backwards and forwards between them. I mean, maybe if I understand the idea right, is that something like what you were suggesting?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think that's one sort of place that an inconsistency actually plays out, that there is both things holding, or that we need to be open to the possibility of all of the deductive outcomes at the edges of our understanding. That's kind of where I think non-classical logic leads us, is to say, well, when you're at the edge, you've got to have an openness to all the possibilities. And that's, I think we're learning that through physics as well at the moment. So it's not a brand new thought, but it's hang on, I'm going to get rid of that noise. It's distracting me. Yeah, it's I guess for me it was the idea that there's to preserve the notion of exploring, and to preserve the kind of ability to explore, the idea that you can actually see the way the world is and understand it, but keep open to that is still your understanding. Those two ideas are compelling, and I think they're really important, but they don't sit comfortably together in a whole range of areas. So that they don't sit comfortably together, I think, underpins who we are and how we find our way around the world as well. So that if we start to be too comfortable on one side or on the other, I think we'll lose something of our ability to navigate the actual world that we're in. We'll tell ourselves it's one way, and doing that might stop us seeing other ways that it is, and increasing our understanding as a species. And also I think it's just not, I think when you look at it on a individual level, it's, to me, it's it can be an over humility, and it can be an over arrogance. It can be too much kind of, oh, this is beyond my understanding. That's damaging to knowledge, and it's damaging to I suppose growth. And if you have the opposite, too much, where you think, well, I know how this is the construct of my mind, this is we can see the limits of our understanding, and that's the point beyond which we shouldn't go. I think that's destructive to knowledge and to growth. So I think both have to be held together. There's an important insight in both. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's really interesting, actually, and it's kind of making me think of, weirdly, it's making me think of Sartre. So, like, I think, if I remember rightly, he says something about, well, the idea of bad faith, right? I think he relates it back to, he thinks that there's this thing called facticity and this other thing called transcendence, and that, like, people are a kind of weird mixture of both of those two things. And bad faith is like having one of them too much. So if you have too much facticity, it's like you telling yourself that I'm just like this type of person, right? And that there's nothing I can do because I'm just this type of person, and that leads you to, I don't know, it's some kind of self-imposed psychological determinism or something. But then again, there's this other attitude which is like having too much transcendence, which is like always thinking, like never really settling on anything, and always like just moving on and never like owning any aspect of your personality as yours or something. And I think he thinks that like getting around bad faith is like living in the middle zone between them, where like you have to sort of balance out this facticity and transcendence thing. I think that's, I mean, I don't know if I understand Sartre really very well at all, but it making me think of what I think about Sartre anyway. So yeah,
that's making me want to read some Sartre. I haven't read him for a long time, but that sounds analogous, to the kind of thinking that I have around this. And I think too that we don't often see the kind of way that we might be pulling one way or the other too much, because it's all based on other assumptions and emotional reactions and politics and so forth that are underpinning where you land, where you decide if maths is constructed or not, will oftentimes depend on whether you think that how you look at things in terms of what the human imagination is capable of, and whether there is something beyond that, and whether it's worth asking that question in the first place. All of that is tied up with who we are. So yeah, I think that analogy is really important as well, because I think it's more than just the raw question of whether maths is this or whether logic is this. It's how we understand the world if there is something that's not us. How do we begin to get our heads around that, and our life? How do we live our life with that?
Okay, good. So, right, let's see. Because I want to dive into the argument in the paper, if that's all right. So I think that the thing you call the ubiquitous assumption, right, is quite familiar and commonplace. And I think even people who don't think about logic too much, there's probably like the common sense everyday view about what logic is. And I think you say it's the sort of thing you can find in the opening pages of lots of logic textbooks. So that, let me see if I can paint the picture right. So the idea is something like, well, so if you're asking what is logic, right? Like as a discipline, like what's it about? What is it? The familiar answer you get is that, well, it's got something to do with when people make arguments informally to each other, like politicians or lawyers or people in the pub chatting about whatever. And so that logic's got something to do with that, right? Or when you're making decisions about what you should do, or all these kind of cases of practical everyday concerns, right? Logic is like, in some sense, it's about that. In the same way that someone says, they pick up a maths textbook and say, hey, what's maths about? And they might say, well, it's like when you're counting eggs in the supermarket, or like, I don't know, you're trying to work out how much cake each person can get if they have an equal amount, or something like that. And so these kind of like practical concerns, right? That those relate to maths. So you might say something like that, like logic has all these practical everyday concerns, and that's what logic's about. And it seems to me that what you're saying there is the ubiquitous assumption is that this reason, the everyday use of, I don't know, rationality or something to make arguments and decisions and stuff, and logic, which on the other side is like has something to do with like drawing inferences from sets of premises, something like that. That those two things are actually not that similar, and it's not a good way of beginning the conversation about what logic is, to just sort of run those two things together and say, oh yeah, logic, it's basically just reason, right, abstracted and perfected or something like that. Does that sound like the right way? That's the dialectic, I take it, that the paper is exploring. Is that right?
Yes, and that's where it started from, that the sort of conviction I felt at the beginning that there's something wrong with this, just this default position of saying it comes from argument, it comes from refining the thought, abstracting across language. I think perhaps to me it was always more that it is applied to, it can be usefully applied to argument and to thought and to reason, but it comes from somewhere else. And the link with maths was compelling to me because I'd already done the philosophy of maths and did a lot of pure maths. And so to me, I could sort of understand logic as related to formal structures more than to something that's abstracted out of language and out of our human condition, I suppose, that we want to call reasonable and rational. Yes, and that part of that is logical, but I think the logical part is an application of the formal structure. So that's where it came from.
Right. So maybe, because it feels to me like a lot of people will find the association between logic and reason to be very intuitive, and the claim that they're, while obviously they overlap, but the claim that they're actually distinct, kind of quite radically distinct from each other, to be kind of counterintuitive. So what reasons would you put forward to explain the thesis to someone to try and make it sound more reasonable? Like, what reasons are there to doubt the ubiquitous assumption? Like, why think that logic is different from reason?
I think we have a conception of reason as human, and that's where I would disagree. So I think our human ability to reason depends on our ability to understand logic and truth and the way the world is, among other things. It also depends on being sensitive to context, to read faces. It depends on what situation you're in, which path is going to be the reasonable or rational one. But yeah, it does depend on among other things, the actual way the world is, or truth, if you want to use the word truth, and discovering that and being responsive to that. So they're two different things. If saying that, saying from the outset that being reasonable and rational is something that's built out of our understanding itself, then traps you and leaves you nowhere to go, I think.
Okay, so I mean, can you give an example of something which you might consider to be like a use of reason, or but that's not logical? Because I think that would be helpful as like an illustration.
I can't off the top of my head. I think. I'm thinking.
Well, so let me suggest. So in the paper, there's kind of an interesting section where you draw upon some work from work by, I guess, like cognitive psychology researchers, and they. So there are these experiments where they have like a card or two cards or whatever with like things on each side, and you're supposed to like how does the experiment make? It's like it's about drawing out how we reason about conditional relationships, where people will assent to if P then Q being true, and then they think, well, if not P then not Q follows as well. Right? Do you remember the experiment that I'm talking about?
Yeah, the examples that are covered in the paper that I wrote, Logic or Reason, are to me not the most compelling ones, although they do illustrate situations. There is an argument those mistakes are not actually mistakes, where people consistently make a mistake and it's called irrational. Maybe that's not quite the right response. It might be a rational response, perhaps in that context and in that situation, although it's a logical error. So those examples in the paper are compelling on that level, but the one that I like best is Edwin Mayer's dog, when it's choosing between two different logics, and it's basically saying what we appeal to as the logical thing to do in a given situation might not be as it seems. So we need to explore that question further. What we think is reasonable might depend on a whole number of factors. So the dog, the Edwin Mayer's dog, is someone reasoning about his master going down a road, and the road is A. And then the dog thinks, because he's a classical dog at this stage, he thinks, well, my master went down road A, or he went down road B, because you're allowed to do that with classical logic. And then he discovers that his master didn't go down road A. And so he infers with modus potens, which is a classical logic law, that his master went down road B. But B was just completely random, was an ad hoc addition. And so if the dog is actually sitting back and being relevant and being careful with the assumptions in play here, he won't just trot off down road B. He'll think, hang on, there could be he went down neither. And then if he's really radical, a paraconsistent dog, could be he went down both. So the question of what's reasonable depends on how you use the logic and which logic you appeal to in a given context. And there are contexts where it's not appropriate in perhaps a way that we would call rational or reasonable to use logic at all. It might be more rational to pull back, it might be more rational to be emotional. It just depends on the context and the situation. So I think what we do is reason, and we use logic to reason in different circumstances, in different ways.
Right. Okay. So reason is like it has a kind of messier structure or something to it. There's you can do things that are reasonable even if like they tout, especially obviously if they tout, I don't know, classical logical principles. And the idea is it can still be reasonable. So this, what we're talking about then, I guess, is these often discussed bits of classical logic that are really counterintuitive, that when you're teaching introduction to logic, no one ever gets material implication. They're always scratching their head at like, why is it that an implication where the antecedent is false and the consequent is true is just classed as true by definition? Or actually, when they're both false, that counts as true by definition as well. That's also weird. And so it's these things that things like relevance logic is supposed to be explaining. But one way of thinking about it, I suppose, is that you're saying, well, look, I might say, well, I don't know, you say, if I'm alive, then I'm dead, right? Because you're alive, the antecedent is false, but the consequent is true. So technically it's a material conditional that that should be considered true. But to my ear, saying if I'm alive, then I'm dead kind of sounds like you're expressing something contradictory. And I might say, well, hold on, it can't be that, right? You can't be both alive and dead. So it can't be that if you're alive, then you're dead, right? That can't be true. So I seem to have a pre-theoretic idea of what type of inferences I'm going to say are reasonable. And that can just deviate from what, like, at least what classical logic will say is logical, right? So that's where we can sort of put a wedge between reason and logic. Is that right? Is that how we would, does that seem like I'm mischaracterizing it?
I think that's definitely one way to argue. That wasn't the way that I was thinking of, but that is definitely one way to argue. You could actually use that same argument, though, to just say that's reason in refinement. So your logic is reason, but you need to continually refine it, and you're discovering as you go more and more about reason. So you could turn that on its head, but I think you've got a point, because classical logic works in lots of contexts. The most notable one is mathematics. So that rule does work, and when you apply it back to human contexts, you can see where they come apart. And I think that, on the face of it, that's a good argument. You could follow through and drive that wedge quite compellingly in that line of thought. But I think also it's just it comes from that basic background assumption that logic is a human construct that makes us think, well, it's the purest way of thinking, or it's the most accurate way of thinking or arguing. That's feeding off the assumption that it's human in the first place, rather than that it has to do with something that's outside of human constructs altogether.
Right. Okay. And so I feel like I've got two different. On the one hand, I feel like there's this case you can make where you could say, so I could retain the ubiquitous assumption, which I understand is one way of going, is that you could just say that the problem here is that we're holding these two things to be too closely connected, reason and logic. And one way of getting out of this is to just separate the two things, which is, I guess, your proposal. But just to play devil's advocate a bit, I feel like there's this other way you can go, which is to say, well, all that does is shows that classical logic isn't the way we reason, at least not, maybe it's classical logic is the way we reason when we're doing mathematics, but it's not the way we reason when we're in, I don't know, more conversational settings, when we're saying things like, if I'm alive, then I'm dead, right? That mathematical logic doesn't seem to be what we're using there, because you have a strong intuition that that's not right. So the thought might be that we just need a different type of logic, right? We just need to cook up a non-classical logic that covers that case as well. So rather than saying that logic and reason are divorced from each other, it's saying something like reason seems to be pluralistic, right? Works differently in different settings. And so logic could be like that as well. And if it was, so if there was lots of different logics for different settings, then could you keep is that one way of going, where you would keep hold of the ubiquitous assumption, just sort of embrace a kind of pluralism about logic?
I think it could be, and I think it has been, but it doesn't need to be. So you can be a pluralist about logic and take logic as something that's not humanist, that's outside of us. So it still might, you can still, when I'm saying logic's not reason, I'm not saying that they don't have an important relationship where you see what's logical and that informs what's reasonable. But it isn't the whole story, because what's logical is also what's true. It plays into what's true mathematically. It plays into what's true physically. It applies to many more things than just human argument and human thought. So that's one angle. I suppose the other angle is to think, when you're looking at different logics in different settings and saying, well, choosing between them, that's an argument in a way to say, oh, well, either those different logics are interrelated in ways that we don't know yet. And in that case, that's an argument then to go, all right, there might be an overarching huge universal logic, a bit like set theory. It probably would be like set theory if there was one. And in that case, it's just still a process of us discovering what's the very, very, very best way to reason. But even then, if you have that sort of argument, you don't need to commit one way or the other. You could say, I believe there's a universal logic. I believe there's, a right way to reason based on the right logic, the one. Go against pluralism. You could say that and believe that logic and reason are the same thing, but you could say that and believe that they're two different things. So it really depends on what your starting assumptions are around whether it's based in the world or outside of us, or a human construct, or a bit of both. It can. Gillisher's recent article on this has argued that it's a bit of both. It's grounded in the world and it's grounded in us. So it's in the mind and it's in the world.
Right. And Maddie has a similar view to that as well, I think.
Yes, she does. Yes.
So her view is a bit, because I'm a bit more familiar with that, is a kind of like a Kantian view, if I understand it right. So it's saying something like, we have these like something like we have like forms of intuition which mirror pretty well the categories of logic, and those two things, even though one of them's external and one of them's internal, they just sort of fortuitously, it seems, overlap with each other, so that you can sort of pretend that one of them's a window into the other one.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that a fair reading of her position, would you say?
Yeah, and when you look at her arguments around logic, they're very similar to the ones around maths and the story of building up a mathematical intuition and an understanding, and the story of how we come to know about maths is similar to what she does with logic. So she builds up a story about how we come to know logical truths in a similar way. And I think she's spot on, but she shies away from that idea at the end because you can't argue for it in a constructive or grounded scientific way, that it's still different. It's still not that. You can describe the story of how we came to know it, how it might have arisen from Kantian categories, or in the case of maths, from counting and from continually abstracting on counting. But that's not everything. That's our understanding of it. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that this strange structure relates to that's not explained by that abstraction story and that kind of accessibility story. You've still got, all right, this mathematical structure and this logical structure are the rules for structures we can never ever access and we could never have abstracted over. And they're also the rules for holding contradictions together. So I think it doesn't explain everything, and I think neither does saying it's outside of us, but I feel like that's, to me, more I think it's a thought that you shouldn't just kick out at the outset. You should keep that thought that there could be more, that it goes beyond. You should keep that thought so that there's not an unnecessary restriction on the thing that then you're going to use, which could be logic or could be maths. So if you restrict it to what you can abstract over, you'll get a restricted set theory in maths. If you restrict it in logic, you'll just get what you can access over continual abstractions and what you can understand, and you might end up maybe rejecting paraconsistent logic or something like that. So I think how you approach it and keeping in mind that it could be more, even if you don't fully commit, I think actually helps further our knowledge and our understanding of whatever this thing is that we're calling logic.
Yeah, okay, good. So what I feel like you get on her view, which is helpful, is in addition to a picture of the metaphysics of logic as something real, in some sense, as independent of our minds anyway, you get some kind of story about how it is that we could come to know those structures, given that they are mirrored by forms of intuition, and then we have a kind of Kantian story about how we come to know those. And I wonder, on a picture which doesn't have that Kantian aspect to it, the kind of more straightforward realist view, what prospect is there for overcoming this kind of Banasaraf sort of problem about, like, you know, if they're really real and mind independent, then in what sense could we know them? I mean, like, you know, you could say that we just remember them like Plato or something, but that seems a bit weird. Is there anything better we can say here for the realist position that you're outlining? Like, how do you know about logic if it's completely independent of us?
I think to presume that we know how we know about cats is a huge step. So Banasaraf said, well, we know that the cat's on the mat because the causal theory of knowledge is obviously the correct one.
Right.
And I think that's where you fall down. We don't know how we know, and we don't know what exactly we know when we know the cat's on the mat. It looks simple, and it is simple insofar as we need it to be, because we're navigating our way around this world that is seemingly constructed of or made up of medium-sized objects. Even the little objects are medium-sized comparative to quantum. So we make kind of assumptions and we feel certainties around those objects and our access and our knowledge of those objects. But I think really, if it comes down to it, we're not any more justified in those knowledge claims than we are in knowledge claims of more abstract and different objects like maths and logic. It may be in hindsight that we discover that we did know, because we discover it in another kind of frame of knowledge. So another, we see all of this is knowledge and it's using this, maybe it is using the causal theory. And then later down the track, we discover, oh, we did know this. So these were considered abstract objects, but now if we can see how they relate to other objects, it may be that it's an ongoing process. So if you compare it with physics, it's like we know stuff about things we can't really know about at all. We've got a theory that works, but we don't understand it. We don't know what the objects of those theories are in quantum mechanics. But I think with the problem of access, I don't think it's a problem that is exclusive to abstract structures. I think it's just that we made a whole lot of other assumptions around physical structures.
Yeah, okay, so you don't see it as being a special problem you just don't see the Banasaraf problem as being a special problem over and above from like more fundamental problems of knowledge that we're facing anyway.
Yeah, that's my gut feeling. It's a hard one to argue. Yeah. But I would be inclined to argue it, because I think we have to question why we are so sure of one theory of knowledge over another, where this comes down to, yes, these are the ways we can know about this, yes, okay, but what we think we know could all be turned on its head by knowledge of an abstract structure. So we really have to be careful with knowledge claims and theories that lock us into one knowledge frame. So I think we do have knowledge of maths. Maybe it is mysterious, but maybe it needs to be at this stage, and it will, as we allow that is knowledge, we will expand our theory of what knowledge actually is. But if we lock it into one thing that only applies to a certain group of objects, again, I think we've restricted ourselves before we should.
Yeah, okay. It's really, I mean, if the metaphysics of logic is an obscure area, the epistemology of logic is an even more obscure area. It's like, it's really hard to know where to even begin with this. Yeah, I mean,
well, it's always been a really clear area, because there's been no question that there is a metaphysics of logic historically. That's just been, the epistemology of logic is just the refinement and abstraction over argument, and it's thought, and it's human. So it's easy to explain how you can know logical laws if you think they're the laws of thought. You can know them in the same way that you know language, and you know we have those comfortable theories of knowledge that we appeal to again. But I guess what I'm saying is, again, once you appeal to one theory of knowledge, you lock down the things that you can know about, and you also lock down what you think knowledge is. And I think the argument for why not to do that, that was badly said, but the argument would be there's so much that overshoots in maths and logic and physics. There's so much that overshoots that theory of knowledge that we then would have to cut out of the realm of things that we could allow ourselves to sensibly think about. That it's too high a price to pay. So I think we say, no, knowledge does encompass this, and now let's broaden our view of what's legitimately known and how it can be legitimately known. We might not have a causal story, but that doesn't mean there is no knowledge.
Right. So this view is, so you have this view, I think it's called optimistic metaphysics or something, is that right? Or optimism about metaphysics.
Yeah.
So it feels to me that we're coming back on this idea quite often here. So it feels to me like you're optimistic about the epistemology of logic for a realist. And am I characterizing your position right there?
Yeah, I suppose I don't feel compelled to tell an epistemological story that I can, argue is as strong and as convincing as the epistemological story for the knowledge that we have of ordinary everyday objects. I don't feel that is a burden on the realist. I think the best answer to, well, how do you know about this stuff, is we do. So let's refine our view of knowledge. It's obviously not just something you can acquire through causal interaction. It's something.
Yeah, I see. Okay, good. So that I think that's helping clear it up. So it's like there's some kind of, one person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens or something, right? So it's like, I mean, if the causal theory says that you can't know about logic, one thing you could say, well, is the causal theory is true, therefore I can't know about logic. But then on the other hand, you could say, but I do know about logic, therefore the causal theory can't be true, right? There must be more to knowledge than what the causal theory says. So just showing that those two theories are incompatible with each other, or that those two claims are incompatible with each other, doesn't actually tell you which way to go. Yeah, that's interesting. And it does feel like it should be a kind of datum of this pre-theory, that there's lots of questions about logic, of course, but like that I don't know anything about it at all. This doesn't seem right. It would be weird to start off or even arrive at a conclusion that kind of question that very fundamental. And in fact, there might be something kind of incoherent about that idea. Like it's difficult to see how you could arrive at that view without using logic at some point. You kind of self-defeating if you ended up saying, well, because of my theory of knowledge, I've inferred rationally through a series of logical steps that I don't know anything about logic. I mean, feels like there's something that must have gone wrong there.
Then it's again, also where you put the burden of explanation, I suppose, where you say, well, this is something that if you can't explain, you have to sacrifice your theory. Well, I think you can have a theory of realism without having to give it up just because you haven't got an adequate theory of knowledge to back that up. I think you've got to weigh up where you've got this explanation gap here, and this theory's got this explanation gap there. What can we live with, and what absolutely will knock it down? And I don't think this is a knockdown one. I think it could come from reading Williamson. I'm thinking Williamson's got an argument where it's not something we can explain. Knowledge is fundamental. It's not a yeah. And so perhaps that's where I've been influenced. It's a new thought. Maybe that's. But I think for me, it's just been, why are you asking that question? Because that question already restricts what you can know. So you've got it is, and it's another recursion. So it's similar to saying, yeah, we can never choose a logic without appealing to a logic. So obviously, logic is internal to humans. It's not something external you can discover, because it's something that we use and we are trapped in, and it keeps going. Then I think knowledge is a bit like that. So if you say knowledge, the limit of knowledge is here, you're using knowledge, your definition of knowledge, to draw the line of where the definition of knowledge should be. Yeah. And I think, yeah, that's dangerous. I think instead saying, okay, what does this idea of knowledge need to accomplish? Where does it apply? And how does it work with all of our other ideas? So
yeah. And that's reminding me of Graham Priest now, because it feels like you're saying, so one of the dangers of saying, maybe like Kant, maybe like Wittgenstein, to say something like, here's the point over which you can't know anything. Like, I can't know anything beyond, I don't know, the extent of the phenomenal realm or something. The noumenal realm is something I can't know anything about. And I think Priest wants to say something like, well, you just kind of said something about it, right? But you can't know anything about it. So like, there's already transgressing that limit that you've set up for yourself. So there's something, it's not only that there's something kind of dogmatic about just saying, here's the line, and we're not going to, let's just all knock past that line. This is where we just agree that this is where knowledge ends and stuff we can't know about begins. Something kind of weirdly dogmatic about that. And it's sort of restricting your ability to progress and make progress.
Yeah,
and find out more
and
stuff.
It's privileging one conception of knowledge over others. It's privileging one theory of what knowledge is over others. So you can either extend the word knowledge, or you could say, no, there are other concepts in play here. Who said knowledge is the most important one? So there's two ways to go on, and Priest goes a bit of a different way to me, but yeah, definitely influenced by his arguments, because he was my supervisor.
He goes a different way to a lot of people, I think. But that's what I mean. There's something quite cool about that, just like exploring really random, like weird ideas, and just seeing where they go, and trying to make something like that seems like it wouldn't make any sense to begin with, and then you kind of go there and go, actually, it's not completely insane. I mean, like I don't know if I buy it, but I can sort of see why someone else might buy it. And
you wouldn't go there if you had locked yourself into this idea of, oh, if you go there, you're being stupid or irrational, or you've gone beyond knowledge. If you've got that kind of assumption locked in, you wouldn't go there.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's kind of the virtue is like open-mindedness or something. It's like I really like that. I think that's I think that's something I can I'd certainly get. I mean, I think that's how I'd like to approach these types of things.
But of course, the danger of that is that it can turn into anything goes. So again, if you overemphasize that everything's beyond and everything's not human, and there's some sort of fundamental inaccessibility, but that we still somehow sort of stumble on, then it sounds like, you know, you've lost all kind of coherent control over your thoughts or your approach, or, you know, your own reaction to what is outside you. So there's got to be a mix. That's what I was saying. There's got to be a mix of both, and appeal to both.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like there's it feels like you've got a question over like whether in these types of really abstract questions, whether, oh god damn it, that's my doorbell. Fuck's sake. I should probably go.
Well, we've got a fair amount of good.
We do, yeah. We've got. I'm going to edit this together in some way that'll work, and then I'll send you something in a couple of days. But I really need.
You've got me thinking I want to go off and read some more stuff. Yeah. And come back.
All right, cool. I'll be in touch. Yeah, nice one. Thanks very much, Penny. Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Bye.